Sim racing is super competitive. Sim racers try to find every single way to get an edge. One of those ways are setups, but setups can be very complicated to get it right. That's why many sim racers have resorted to setup shops to get that edge. But are paid setups worth it? Well, today's sponsor, Hymo, says that their setups are definitely worthwhile. Running the risk of sounding like Matthew McConaughey on South Park.
I was driving a handy car way before I got paid to drive one.
I have used and bought Hymo setups before they sponsored this video. While today's video is about Hymo and the difference it can make, a lot of the things that I say here can be applied elsewhere. With such a competitive landscape, sim racers try to find an edge everywhere they can. Setups are an area where the setup can make a massive difference. An extreme example with iRacing, setups for a lot of series, road and track, are almost mandatory. Not running a setup that week essentially means not being competitive. Assetto Corsa Competizione is definitely more lenient. It has decent default setups that an experienced driver can extract performance out of. However, these setups are not always enough. On ACC's side of things, Competizione's online changed a lot with low-fuel motorsports. Daily racing is now so much more popular, and therefore setups become far more important. This year I did quite a lot of low-fuel motorsports. This is where my story with Hymo started. I started streaming a few times a week from the beginning of the year until September, and every week was basically the same story. I've hunted and purchased setups. Then I came across Hymo when, back in May, one of the team members, which is Dyer McCormack, sent me a few to test. The impact on my daily racing performance was impressive, even for someone like a noob like myself. Hymo are a relatively small team behind the setups. You might know some of these guys. So we have Dyer McCormack, you got Maciej Malinowski, or Tortellini, a guy that if you know about him, he doesn't really like pasta. You got Valentin Barrier, Tinko van der Velde, and Charlie Crossland. All of these guys are extremely fast and accomplished drivers in Competizione. Let's get something out of the way first. Using Hymo or any other setup doesn't mean that the car will be automatically faster. First of all, you still need to drive the setup, you need to get used to it and the combination that it does with the car. Sometimes, no matter what you do, the car will simply not improve because it will not gel with the way you drive it. Very rarely a setup will change something on the car that you do not like about it. If there's certain dynamics of the car that cannot be moved out with the setup, it doesn't mean you're gonna like with the setup. Setups are generally done to accentuate driving dynamics that are advantageous for the driver and file down a few imperfections. They are not, nor there will ever be, a silver bullet. Part of all of this is the experience you have with the car, the familiarity you have with it. Hymo even said to me that even though the target of these setups are drivers who aim to be better and are not afraid of making mistakes, they don't really suggest beginners to buy the setups, especially if they don't have any experience at all. For beginners, what they say and what I say is, find out what a game is about, find the dynamics of the game, of the cars you're gonna try first. Learn the presets, the aggressive presets, the safe presets, and wet presets, what things do on the game. Build your experience from that, and if you think you're gonna hit an edge when you are just a second or two behind pace, you might be looking at something like this. So first of all, cover all the basics. And to help with covering the basics, press that subscribe button. Now for the money, for the dosh, these setups are $4.99 per car track combination, so they're not cheap, and they will include a qualifying setup, a racing setup, as well as the Motec. And before some of you moan, this is the price that setups have been not only in Assetto Corsa Competizione, but also in iRacing. So how about the impact on the driving? Well, I did a non-scientific experience covering a couple of tracks with a couple of cars. This video can't be representative of everything, but it serves mainly to highlight various differences besides just the lap times. It serves also a way as to understand if a more average skill driver, one that has at least the basics covered, but it's not very esports, can extract performance from them. But most importantly, it's to check out if paid setups are of any value. So for the test, We have the same conditions in the hot lap. I always start first with the HIMO setups because if there should be any advantage, it should go to the aggressive setup. By the means of being last, you do more laps first. The setup is going to be harmonized, so we can make this fair. That means the pressure should be 27.5 in the track. The pads are the same, and the traction control and brake bias is the way it feels it's right for me. By the means of testing, that means that the aggressive setup and the HIMO setup actually ran with the same traction control and brake bias. And this is what is meant by learn the game. You really need to know what these adjustments do. There's no point whatsoever buying a setup like this and you don't even know what a traction control does. After both of them are harmonized, these setups can now compare fairly. Two scenarios, one in Imola with the Audi, a car I'm familiar with, and one at Kyalami with a car I don't. 8 running laps, the worst 2 performing laps are going to go out. And the result is, wow, so different. Actually, no, it was more or less expected. There is a difference, it isn't huge. So in Imola, with the HIMO setup, I'm doing my best lap of 141.317 with an average of 141.485. In Imola, with the aggressive setup, it's the best lap of 141.692 with an average of 141.828. That means 3.5 tenths difference. On Kyalami, with a car I don't know that much, I do a best of 141.465 with an average of 141.622. With the aggressive setup, I do a best of 141.910 with an average of 142.090. So the difference in this case will be 4 tenths. So what we got here in both scenarios is that the stock setup was slower by about 4 tenths. The HIMO setups are definitely far more agile while still being composed and decent on the curbs. These setups are much better to attack the corner entry, and they're faster in fast corners, and they're so much better on the exit. Every single chicane always had the car on the better line with the better exit. The aggressive setup requires the car to be driven a little harder to make it rotate. This happens because this setup is safer and has significant understeer, noticeably, especially at Acqua Minerale Complex and Sunset and S's at Kyalami. The aggressive setup, don't get me wrong, is definitely good, but lacks the details. The HIMO setups then are made for sheer maneuverability at the expectation of a driver to have control of the car, while still not being that edgy in most cases. You might say to yourself, this is not a big result, and you'd be right, 4 tenths isn't really that much, but in a scenario like LFM, 4 tenths will very easily put you in the lower half of the split. I've been in many races where even a tenth on qualify was 7 or 8 spots. So over the course of a short 25-minute race, and this is going to be at very least 6 seconds, because if you are slower, you're going to lose more time because you're going to fight for position. Even with all of this, there are situations where I didn't like the HIMO setups. I couldn't drive, for example, the Audi R8s around Brands Hatch. The standard aggressive were more comfortable to drive over a longer time. They might be a little bit slower, but if I'm always on the edge with a setup like this, I much rather go to the safer one. Once again, going towards the aggressives, some of those 4 tenths can definitely be trimmed down by small adjustments, but the last tenth or two, at least in my hands, will definitely be very difficult. The difference in these setups that creates the lap differential is due to the time invested in setting up the dampers of the car. Fine adjustments can take hours of trying. Something really important, as we know, ACC changes all the time. There are updates that are sent every so often, and whenever this happens, sometimes the setups need to change as well. Setups from previous versions of the game can become quite different to drive, and they will not feel the same. So in this case, there will be a 1-year update window on them where the setups are updated and for free for those who purchase. So it won't ever be the case that you get one and then after an update, maybe it be a few days or weeks down the line, it becomes far slower and you'll have to buy them again. I know some of you might be saying in the comments that I should teach you how to do a setup like this instead of where to buy a setup like HIMO. But here's the thing, while I know the basics of fixing the setups at a very small degree, I do not know how to build a setup at this level, and that's why I buy it from setup shops. If I knew how to build a setup like this, I would certainly tell you how to do it, but I really can't. But I'm not going to leave you empty-handed. I'm going to give you a cheat sheet by Chris A that can help you somewhat on tuning your own setups. I've bought and used HIMO in the past before this video, and I will continue to do so in the future, but remember, these setups are not silver bullets, And if you are some way out of the pace, these won't do any difference whatsoever to your experience in Assetto Corsa Competizione or around the track. In that case, make sure you cover all the basics. From my experience, IMO setups have been very good to me, and I can definitely recommend these setups if you are on the average-ish side like me.
And just like how it feels.